Long have men gazed upon these southern scapes, ignoring their trees clothed in silver drapes, and if ever they choose to appreciate what adorns their olden wood, then forever they will know the legends that they whisper are very good. Today, I have quite the task set before me, which is to convince you that this stuff, commonly called Spanish moss, is actually really cool, in spite of the fact that at best you probably either don't care about it, or at worst have deliberately avoided it throughout your entire life. I can't even really be bothered with making a proper intro for this video, as there is a bit of an elephant in the room that I need to address. The strange fear that this plant struck in everybody I knew growing up, including myself. Those of you from, normal parts of the world might be a little confused by that. Isn't this just some sort of moss? No. If you, like myself, are from the southern United States, then you would know that it might as well have been talked about as if it were like Satan's school bus or something. That stigma is all due to the presumption that it houses these very tiny little mites, commonly called redbugs, or especially in regards to their larval form, chiggers. In that stage of their life cycle, they attach themselves to the skin of whatever animal they can latch onto, sometimes humans, and gorge themselves upon its flesh for a few days. In the aftermath of that process, however, they leave behind what is often described as infuriatingly itchy bumps or rashes. Understandably, people want to avoid that, and as an extension of that, they will aim to avoid things they believe to be associated with that. In this case, it's our Spanish moss, which is accused of more than just about anything else of housing these little bugs. I don't think I can stress how ingrained this caution was growing up for me. Given the way people described it, you'd have thought that they were so infested with chiggers that if you even passingly brushed against it, your month would be ruined or something. The funny thing is, though, is that this fear might be made up or wrong. You can find different studies on the inhabitants of Spanish moss going back over a century, and none of them list chiggers even once. Now, I don't want you to hear that and then go and immediately dive into your nearest conveniently placed pile of Spanish moss. I need to add some qualifications. If you actually read these studies, they're all pretty limited in scope, and not particularly exhaustive in dealing with all the possible variables. What I mean by that is that these studies could be totally accurate, and chiggers could still greatly infest Spanish moss in a lot of places. Folk wisdom would certainly suggest this. I've even found references to it going back all the way to the 1800s, and I don't want to be the type of person to dismiss that. Just how much are chiggers in Spanish moss? I can't really be sure yet, we don't really have the data. On the level of basic reason, however, I think we can make an important inference. Chiggers have to live close to the ground. Their goal is to latch onto the feet, ankles, or legs of some passerby organism. Because of that, it would make zero sense for them to live in hanging moss. That could place them who knows how high into the air, out of reach of any potential hosts. Inhabiting already fallen moss is, however, much more behaviorally plausible. Because of this, I think my general encouragement would be to be more wary of fallen Spanish moss, and less apprehensive of any collections still up in the trees. Really though, even if they're not crawling with chiggers, there are still plenty of other insects or arachnids that may still be taking up residence. In some contexts, you may want to be more cautious, and in others, not as much. I say just treat it however you would treat any other part of nature. Use your own discretion. I don't want to be responsible for any itchy arms or legs. Or worse stuff, who knows. Having now dealt with what I believe to be the biggest barrier in the way of making this moss more appealing, I feel I should give some introductory facts on it. You know this species as Spanish moss, a name that by its own nature kinda misleads you, as it is neither of Spain nor actually a species of moss. Even its scientific name, Tillandsia usneoides, literally describes it as just looking like another species of actual moss. So, serious identity crisis on our hands for this video. In fairness, it probably could have ended up with dozens of different names depending on mild shifts in circumstances. I'll explain how we got our current one a bit later though. For the moment, This species inhabits a good portion of the New World, especially the warmer parts, but in recent times has established populations in various Pacific islands and also Australia. Because it's Australia, this video, however, is going to focus almost exclusively on its role in the southern United States regarding what this Spanish moss actually is. Believe it or not, it's a flowering plant. They're easy to miss, but at certain times of the year they do have these cute little green flowers. Contrary to a lot of people's first suspicion, it's also not parasitic. It literally just hangs out on trees or other objects. It gets everything it needs from the air, any accompanying humidity, and runoff from whatever branch or object that it's wrapped itself around. That being said, it can potentially grow to such a point to where it either causes structural damage or to some extent blocks out other vegetation from the sunshine. This plant, being in the family Bromeliaceae, is actually more closely related to pineapples than anything else that you may have been thinking of. That feels really weird, but I like it. I needn't really talk much further on that though. I'm sure the biology, ecology, and whatever else is interesting, but I'm not really that guy. What I do care about is the lore. For this, I did go back and browse works published by various ethnographers and folklorists from the early 1900s and prior, some early travelogues as well, whose data varied in origin from American Indian, Black American, and White American. If one were just to go off of that, they'd probably actually come away pretty disappointed in regards to any super meaningful traditions, stories, or songs about Spanish moss. It's mostly just early colonial descriptions that may have had a stray mention of the species here or there. It's often in relation to more practical uses. Clothing, that was the most common one, furniture, medicine, or other niche uses. Even in sports, I really enjoyed reading about that last one. As much as I love what I did find in other places, I need to be humble and admit that my pet appreciation here wasn't really the biggest deal back then, or any time really. Because of that, the stories that we do have are all from the 20th century, mostly from smaller local newspapers and historical societies. Some of these tales could certainly date back to much earlier, but realistically, I expect that I'll only ever be able to pin them down to the 1900s. There is something about that which actually kind of disappoints me a little. These stories were verifiably in circulation within the last century, even if on a more smaller scale, and I'd never heard anything about any of them from anybody. Having said all that, I think it is now about time that I tell you some of the stories that I kinda wish had gotten passed on to me. I'll begin with the stories that elaborate more on the etymology. Our current common name, Spanish moss, is actually an evolution of one of the more dominant earlier names, Spanish beard. It is reported this was a jest created by the French colonials to the New World in reference to the fact that, well, they thought it looked like a Spaniard's beard. That's a funny story in and of itself, and the Spanish did actually in fact attempt to retort back, but the original insult stuck. Because of this oddity in nomenclature, it seems that a number of folk stories have arisen in order to explain that. I've taken to calling these the beard narratives. The most circulated one by far is the Gorez-Gaz narrative. It's been adjusted and adapted over the past century, with the earliest I found printed back to 1927. The story comes in the form of a poem, which I will reluctantly attempt to do justice to. Don Gorez-Gaz and the good ship Agree came from Spain across the sea, and a terribly mean old man was he. A cake of soap and a yard of braid was every cent that Gorez paid for a perfectly beautiful Indian maid, and the braid was tarnished as it could be, which the Indian maiden could plainly see. She turned and fled, and grim as death Gorez followed till out of breath. The damsel was forced to climb a tree, and Gorez followed, but oh hear me, the branches tangled up in his beard and held so tightly it appeared he'd have to remain indefinitely old Gorez-Gaz of the good ship Agree. All but his beard has faded away, but there it hangs to this very day. A terrible warning to all who hope to win a maid with a cake of soap and a yard of braid that she can see isn't as good as it used to be. I think it's fun, and it actually seems to have set a bit of a precedent going forward. The other tales that posit the origin of Spanish moss as having come from the beard of a man usually tend to make said man the villain of the story. At face value, this and its sister tales are, for very obvious reasons, from at least the colonial era, but in my opinion they come probably way later than even that, as a fun, after-the-fact sort of way of explaining the etymology which by that point had probably kind of been lost. Switching our path a little bit from that, let's move up from beard hair to hair. In these stories, the Spanish moss almost always comes from the hair of a woman, usually a young American Indian woman. These tellings also tend to have a more tragic emphasis to them. There are a lot of more entries under this category, and thus there is a bit more variation as well. For the moment, though, I'll read out to you the earliest I've encountered, so far dating back to 1922. In days of legendary lore, perhaps 1,000 years or more, in lands where summer suns do shine in spring and fall and winter time, lived an Indian girl of such rare grace as had never been seen in many a race. The chief of the largest Indian tribe had besought her to become his bride. The morrow was their wedding day, and all the tribes in their best array did celebrate the nuptial rites between Hassie the Brave and Laughing Eyes. But soon a terrible strife arose between Hassie's tribe and their deadly foes, and though a victory was won, the days of Hassie the Brave were done, and Laughing Eyes, overwhelmed with grief, died for love of her fallen chief. They buried them both in one lone grave, Laughing Eyes and Hassie the Brave, the jetty locks of the chieftain's wife, her joy and beauty and pride in life, were hung on an oak above the grave to mourn the loss of Hassie the Brave. In coming years the hair turned gray, and a weaving moss is seen today. On every oaken tree this moss will grow, and when to southern climes you go, the trees neath those fair skies, the trees whisper to you of Hassie and Laughing Eyes. That should give you a general sense for how a lot of the other hair narratives play out. As I said though, there is definitely more variation. Sometimes the woman is killed by jealous suitors, sometimes she just dies. Sometimes the man lives, other times he dies. Sometimes it's in the colonial age, and others it's in the age of legend. Sometimes she is a princess, even the daughter of a deity in one case, and in others she is portrayed as a normal woman. In I think all cases though, her hair is separated from the rest of her body and left to hang upon a tree. That hair, of course, would eventually spread, becoming grayer, until it became what we know today as Spanish moss. One of my favorite renditions of this formula actually takes advantage of the fact that Spanish moss actually has a reddish color on its interior and gives the woman of the story hair of the same color, making it into a sort of slow reveal as the story goes along. I'll be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if some of the stories in this category had some far-off roots in the pre-colonial past of America, although I wouldn't really be too emphatic about that. I mostly say that on the basis that Spanish moss, by its appearance, is just so ripe with storytelling potential, and these seem like pretty intuitive and timeless stories that could be made over and over again. Overall, I'm really fond of these two categories of stories, the beard and the hair. Respectively, it feels like they represent two sentiments common to a lot of stories and imagery in the South. Everything so far has been a little gloomy and gray, but given what the South and its moss are, I think that's okay. Not hopeless, but not full of joy either. It is this fact that has made me so especially fond of our final category of story, what I've taken to calling the cloud narratives. There are only two uniquely identifiable ones that I've come across as of yet, but they are both presented as much more stereotypically Native American. Like basically everything else, they first appear in the earlier half of the 20th century, but for all I know they could have pre-colonial roots. I'm neither learned nor familiar enough with American Indian cultures to differentiate between authentic traditions versus stories meant to mimic authentic traditions. In any case, I've much enjoyed thinking on these tales. The earlier one comes in 1922 and is actually sort of long, so I won't read it out to you in full. It is introduced to us as the story of a Miss Boggart, a mixed woman of native and black ancestry, recounted later by her daughter and eventually written down by presumably a white woman. A lot of influences here. It begins by anthropomorphizing the prevailing winds over the region of Florida. A feminine, gentle south wind holds authority over this land with their own subordinate winds, keeping a spring-like habitat amidst all of it. Then there was the father of winds, and he who considered that an eternal spring would diminish the value of spring, decided to give a harsher and more masculine northern wind rule over her territory for 3 months of the year. She was reluctant to do this, but she put her worries aside when the Father of Winds ordered some gray clouds to come down from the sky and into the trees, which could envelop her and her subjects in warmth as they slept through the winter. Once the North Wind first came down to hold the land, he did originally ponder making icicles, but seeing the South Wind and all her subordinates snuggled up in these little clouds amidst the branches, he decided that they already looked enough like icicles and stayed his hand. Furthermore, he was so pleased with the beauty of the land that he never brought too harsh of weather onto it even after this. At the end of the North Wind's brief first reign, the South Wind and her other winds once again emerged and left their clouds hanging in the trees, becoming what we know today as Spanish moss. I hope I explained that all well, and to give what was my first reaction to this, there is just something about this that is just incredibly cute to me, if that's the right word. It's just like an innocent element to it that I find really charming. My single favorite part of the story might be the comparison of Spanish moss to icicles. I'd never heard anything like that before, but following this video I hope to think of these as kind of like Florida icicles for the rest of my life. I have some more thoughts, but I want to tell you the other story first. It comes later and is much shorter, so I'll read it out to you in full. It, quote, is that of an Indian mother and 2 children trapped by rising waters during a storm which was accompanied by sudden cold. Taking refuge in a large tree, the mother implored the moon to shine on them, lest they die. In the morning the sky had cleared and the trees were clothed in moss, giving warmth to the marooned group. See, mother, cried the small son, the moon heard us. See, she tore up the storm clouds and threw them down upon us, for there are none left in the sky. End quote. This is another story that I would describe as in some way cute or comforting. The clouds are still sent down for the sake of safety and warmth, but now it is the moon granting their use, and it begins on a worse note as well. It's a lot shorter, so there isn't as much as I can say pertaining to this tale specifically. One thing I can say for both stories, though, is that the 2 of them appear to be abridgments or simplifications of a longer story in some way, especially the latter one, both from the substance of the story themselves, but also the surrounding context in which they are described. That's a little disappointing, but that's kind of also the nature of oral storytelling, so who am I to complain? Another thing that I'm much more curious about now is how much further these 2 stories could go back. This conception of clouds as some sort of warm, cozy blanket almost, which could be sent down from the skies, comes across to me as like very foreign compared to what I would expect to be the norm during this time period, or even during the 1800s or prior. When I first read this, it felt like the kind of thing that a much older culture living in the lowlands of the American South may come up with. Clouds can look pretty comfy from all the way on the ground, even if we know that they'd probably be cold or wet up close now. So maybe this is an early intuition that's kind of just been forgotten. Maybe it could be in a reverse sort of way, however. Local indigenous cultures are pretty well documented as having used Spanish moss in their clothing, so maybe they projected their experiences with that onto the similar looking clouds. Who knows? Either way, I have a lot more thinking to do on this topic. There's probably a lot more that I could talk on regarding this topic as a whole, but I've decided on this as my final bow tie for this video. It comes from a single mention from 1877, in which it is described that Spanish moss was actually used in Christmas decorations of all things. I wish I could stress just how overjoyed and simultaneously disappointed I was when I first encountered this. Overjoyed because of how great an idea I think this sounds. Disappointed because I don't think it ever got passed on. It's a short little passage that describes quantities being shipped up north to decorate churches and houses, all the way up in Philadelphia even. I don't believe it was ever a particularly big thing. I haven't found other contemporary reference to it as of yet, but it was at least a thing, it appears. I'm more so wondering why the South, and specifically Florida, isn't doing this. The mood just feels like it could be so perfect. I would love to imagine going to church on Christmas. It's cold, not freezing, but cold. The skies are gray and overcast. Maybe it'll rain in a few hours, who knows. The buildings and steeples all around you are decorated with streams of silver to match the equally dampened clouds. Something about that feels incredibly cozy and happy. I'd love to see that become a thing in my lifetime. To be frank, with all my brothers and sisters from Florida, we'll probably never see a white Christmas in our life. Instead, I suggest that we learn how to embrace and enjoy the silver Christmas that perhaps we always should have done. With that said, I want to thank you for your time and attention. I hope that I was able to make it worth it. God bless, and goodbye.